The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren, dirt-scratched ground of a Japanese POW camp. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of smoke and sweat. Gunfire echoed faintly in the distance, a constant reminder of the war that had ravaged the world for years. Inside the camp, the smell of rice and rations clung to the walls, mixing with the palpable tension that gripped every soldier, every prisoner. It is late 1945, September to be precise, and the American forces have successfully captured thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians. Among them are a group of women who had served in auxiliary roles during the conflict. These women were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were tasked with non-combat duties, nurses, clerks, and telephone operators, functions that nevertheless tied them to the war effort in ways that would soon become much more profound. The women sat quietly in a corner of the camp, their faces shadowed in weariness. Though beaten down by months of starvation, grueling work, and constant fear, there was still a flicker of pride in their eyes. They were loyal to the emperor, and this loyalty had been instilled in them since childhood. Japan's ideology of Bushido, the way of the warrior, had shaped their world, and the idea of surrender, let alone captivity, was foreign to them. The camp itself was an unwelcome sight: barbed wire fences, guard towers, and rows upon rows of makeshift tents where prisoners tried to stay warm through the long, unforgiving nights. This was not the grand imperial palace, but for these women, it might as well have been the furthest thing from it. Then one day, the unimaginable happened. The American Guard soldiers who had fought against their nation for years began to show a strange kindness. A commanding officer approached them, his uniform crisp, the red of his insignia a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. He addressed them with an unusual offer, a chance to sing. It was a simple request, yet it was powerful enough to shake the foundations of everything these women had been raised to believe. In their minds, this gesture was foreign. It wasn't common practice for the victor to offer the vanquished any semblance of dignity. It felt almost cruel. Yet it was also a sign of something else, a shift in the dynamics of power, a glimpse of the new world they were being thrust into. As they stood in the camp, hesitant, their voices trembled at first. These women, who had spent their entire lives worshiping the emperor, were now being asked to sing in front of the very soldiers who had come to dismantle everything they held dear. And in that moment they realized something that would stay with them forever. This war was not just about battles fought on the front lines, it was also a war for the very souls of those involved. The Pacific War had been raging for nearly 4 years, with the United States and Japan locked in a brutal, all-consuming conflict. It began with Japan's aggressive expansion across the Pacific, culminating in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. For the Japanese, the attack was a decisive blow aimed at crippling the U.S. Navy, a strategic move designed to secure their dominance over the Pacific. For the Americans, it was a wake-up call, one that led them to declare war on Japan and thrust the world deeper into the chaos of global conflict. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had taken a devastating toll on both sides. After the fall of the Philippines, the Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had begun a relentless push across the Pacific Islands, reclaiming territory one island at a time. The Japanese forces, though initially formidable, had begun to retreat as the U.S. advanced. The battle for Okinawa, fought in the spring of 1945, was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific, signaling the impending defeat of the Japanese Empire. The atmosphere was tense in Japan, and this feeling had been compounded by the increasingly desperate situation on the battlefield. Japan's military leaders were determined to defend their homeland at all costs, even if it meant using civilians and non-combatants in the war effort. But as the Americans drew closer, the harsh reality of defeat loomed large. Japan's military strategy, based heavily on the concept of sacrifice for the emperor, had begun to falter under the weight of defeat. Yet in the face of overwhelming odds, the Japanese leadership continued to push for total war, as though the victory of their empire depended on it. These ideals shaped the lives of millions, including the women who had joined the war effort in various support roles. In the midst of the devastation, it was not just the soldiers who were affected. The women of Japan, raised to revere their emperor and serve their country, found themselves caught between two worlds, one that demanded complete loyalty to the nation, and another that was being imposed upon them by the victors of the war. As the war continued to unfold, the conditions of the Japanese prisoners of war grew worse. Rations were minimal and the constant threat of violence was ever present. The women in the camp were not immune to these challenges, yet it was their resolve, their internal strength, that would define their experience in captivity. They were caught between fear and defiance, unsure of how to survive in a world that no longer made sense to them. Despite this, their lives were about to change in ways they could not have predicted. The arrival of the American Guards, with their strange offer to let them sing, would mark the beginning of a transformation, a shift from the brutal reality of captivity to an opportunity to reflect on their own beliefs, their place in the world, and the changing tides of history. The sing-along, so seemingly small in its nature, was the first taste of a new reality, one that was not about war, destruction, and hatred, but about reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost in the fog of battle. For these women, it was a moment of revelation. The women gathered in a small shaded corner of the camp, their faces still carrying the weight of war. For many, the sounds of the past few years, bombs dropping, the roar of aircraft, the distant screams of soldiers, had become a permanent fixture in their lives. But now an unfamiliar silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the light rustling of wind through the tents and the occasional clink of metal from the camp's guard towers. The request to sing had taken them by surprise. It seemed almost too simple, too intimate given their circumstances. But there was no denying the curiosity that stirred within them. This was not something they had ever expected from the enemy. Yet here they were, prisoners of a war they had fought to win, being asked to engage in an act of human expression, singing. At first, their voices were tentative, unsure, as though they feared the act might somehow dishonor their emperor or their country. But as the words began to flow, a surprising transformation took place. The harsh reality of their circumstances faded, if only for a brief moment. The songs, some old, others more contemporary, were filled with nostalgia and longing. Each note was an echo of the lives they once knew, lives filled with duty, discipline, and devotion to a higher cause. In that moment, the American soldiers, standing watch in the distance, witnessed something they had not expected, a raw, human connection between victors and vanquished, between soldiers and civilians. The sound of the women's voices, trembling but strong, reverberated through the camp, reaching the hearts of those who were listening, transcending the anger, resentment, and loss that had defined the conflict. The soldiers, hardened by battle and trauma, were left speechless by the raw emotion that the women poured into their song. It was as though the very essence of the war, its hatred, its violence, its destruction, had been momentarily stripped away, leaving something far more profound: humanity. It was a realization that no battle or military strategy could ever capture. For the women, the act of singing was cathartic. It offered them a way to reclaim something lost, even if only for a short time. It gave them a fleeting sense of dignity and control over their own fate, a chance to express their own sorrow, anger, and hopes. They were no longer just prisoners. They were human beings again, capable of feeling and expressing their deepest emotions. But even as the music echoed through the camp, the weight of the war loomed large. The Americans who had heard the women's voices were still soldiers, soldiers who had fought and sacrificed much to reach this point. And while the singing may have bridged a gap, it didn't erase the brutal realities of their mission. These women, though now seen as individuals rather than mere captives, still faced the consequences of their nation's actions. The harshness of captivity and the uncertain future were still present, even as the notes of the song carried a brief respite from the horrors that had come before. But it was undeniable. The war had created a new reality for these women. Their place in the world was no longer defined by the ideals they had been taught, nor by the emperor they had once revered. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a psychological and emotional battleground. Their voices, once muted by years of oppression, had found a way to break through. And it was this act, this simple yet profound expression of humanity, that marked a turning point for them. The war, though technically nearing its end, left deep scars that would not easily fade. For the women who had been part of the Japanese auxiliary services, The capture and subsequent imprisonment marked a significant rupture in their lives. No longer were they soldiers in the eyes of their nation. The Japanese Empire, their guiding force, had been defeated, and the harsh reality of their new existence in American captivity settled upon them like a heavy cloak. But it was through this dark and painful time that a transformation took place, not only in the women themselves, but in the understanding of the human spirit in times of despair. The singing in the camp became a pivotal moment, a symbol of resilience and survival. It showed that even in captivity, these women found a way to express themselves, to reclaim a part of their identity that had been suppressed by the demands of war. The act of singing was not just a momentary escape, but a defiant statement of their humanity. It was an acknowledgement that while they had lost the war, they had not lost everything that made them who they were. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the women who had been prisoners were sent to camps in the U.S. and were gradually released. For many of them, the transition from being prisoners of war to civilian life was nothing short of traumatic. The psychological toll was immense. The war had shattered their understanding of the world and their place in it. Their once unshakable loyalty to the emperor and the Japanese war machine had been called into question, as had their belief in the righteousness of their cause. But as they returned to Japan, many of the women found that the world they returned to was not the one they had known before. The post-war landscape was marked by a sweeping reorientation of Japan's values and its place in the world. Under the direction of General MacArthur and the American occupation, Japan underwent a dramatic cultural and political transformation. The emperor, once considered a divine figure, was now seen as a symbolic leader stripped of political power. The militaristic ideologies that had defined the nation were replaced by democratic principles. For these women, the transition from wartime to post-war Japan was a difficult one. The propaganda they had been raised with, which extolled the virtues of sacrifice for the emperor and the nation, was now seen as a lie, a tool used to maintain control. Many of these women struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and betrayal, as they reconciled their past actions with the new world they were being asked to embrace. Yet, in a strange way, the act of singing in the camp became emblematic of this transition. It was through music, through the expression of emotion that was no longer suppressed, that the women began to heal. The act of singing, so simple yet so profound, was the first step in breaking down the walls of militaristic indoctrination. It allowed them to connect with their own emotions, to process their grief, anger, and fear, and to begin rebuilding their identities in a world that no longer demanded their blind obedience. The psychological effects of the war would continue to haunt them for years. Many of these women never truly came to terms with the brutality they had witnessed or the horrors they had endured, but over time some found a sense of peace. They learned to live in the shadow of the war, acknowledging the trauma but refusing to let it define them. For the Americans, the women's song was a reminder of the human cost of war. It highlighted the complexity of the human experience in conflict, the way that individuals on both sides of the battle can be caught up in a greater narrative beyond their control. The American soldiers who had witnessed the women's song may have felt pity, anger, or perhaps even guilt. But it was also a profound moment of reflection, one that underscored the reality that war is never just about victory and defeat. It's about the people caught in between. The aftermath of the event had implications beyond the emotional realm. It marked a significant turning point in the way the American occupation viewed Japanese prisoners. It was a reminder that even in the most horrific of circumstances, people still held within them the potential for humanity, for compassion, and for resilience. In the decades that followed, this episode, along with others like it, became part of a broader narrative about the consequences of war. For the women who had been prisoners, it was a reminder of how far they had come, not just physically but emotionally. They had been forced to confront their past, their beliefs, and their place in a world that had been irrevocably changed by the war. The lasting impact of the event was more than just personal. It was a reflection of the psychological and moral dilemmas that emerge when war ends and the healing begins. For the world, it was a moment of introspection, a chance to understand that the end of war does not automatically bring peace. Instead, peace must be worked for, fought for, and rebuilt from the very human experiences that define it. The women who sang in the camp were not simply prisoners of war. They were symbols of resilience, of the enduring power of the human spirit to find meaning even in the darkest of times, and their voices echoing across the camp remind us of the complex and often painful path to healing and redemption. Their story, one of war, suffering, and ultimately self-reclamation, is a testament to the enduring power of humanity, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. This chapter of World War II, while often overlooked, provides an essential lesson on the personal costs of war. It teaches us that beyond the battlefield, the true struggle lies in the process of rebuilding what was lost, and in finding a way to move forward when everything else has been destroyed.